Martha had been retired for nearly a decade when she first heard the latch on her garden gate lift on its own. She looked up from her tea, expecting a neighbor, maybe a delivery boy. But the shape standing there in the fading light was neither. It was taller, broader, and its fur glinted gold in the autumn sun. The moment their eyes met, she felt the years fold back like pages in an old book. It was him. The cub she had nursed through the worst winter of her life, now a full-grown bear, and somehow, impossibly, standing at her gate like he'd been invited. The first time Martha saw him, he was no bigger than the neighbor's spaniel and shaking so hard it rattled the damp leaves under him. It was early spring, the snow still clinging stubbornly to the edges of the clearing, and she had been out searching for early fiddlehead ferns to bring home for supper. She almost didn't see him, just a mound of brown fur under the roots of an old spruce. When she crouched closer, the smell of wet earth and pine needles filled her nose, along with something faintly sour, hunger. The cub lifted his head slowly, his eyes dark and glassy with exhaustion. He didn't run. That was her first sign something was wrong. Martha had taught school in this mountain valley for 40 years before retiring. She had raised 3 children of her own and helped half the town's kids learn their first letters, their first sums. She recognized need when she saw it, whether it came from a child in a worn coat or a half-starved animal in the undergrowth. She sat cross-legged a few feet away, her voice low and steady. "Where's your mama, little one?" She knew the answer, of course, or she feared she did. It took her the better part of an hour to coax him out. When he finally stepped into the open, she could see how thin he was, the knobs of his ribs pressing through his coat. He wobbled when he walked, as though the ground might give way beneath him at any second. Back at her cottage, she set him up in the small shed behind the house, lining a basket with old wool blankets. She warmed goat's milk on the stove, adding a pinch of honey, and fed it to him in a wide dish. He lapped at it with slow, awkward swipes of his tongue until the bowl was empty. Over the next weeks, her days fell into a rhythm she hadn't expected. Mornings began with a trip to the shed to check on him. By then, she'd named him Alder, after the trees lining the creek. She would bring bowls of milk, later softened oatmeal, then foraged berries as the season warmed. She cleaned his bedding, checked his paws for injury, and let him explore the fenced garden under her watch. The cub grew stronger. His steps steadied, his eyes brightened, and he began to follow her everywhere, a small shadow with fur that smelled faintly of sun-warmed straw. Martha never forgot he was wild. She didn't pet him like a dog or try to keep him as one, but she spoke to him the way she had with her students, explaining, pointing out the plants and the sky, as though every moment was a lesson. By midsummer, she knew he would have to go. Keeping him too long would only dull the instincts he'd need to survive. So she began to take him farther afield, into the meadows, then the lower forest, showing him where the berry thickets grew and how to dig for grubs beneath rotting logs. The day he finally disappeared into the pines, she told herself it was what she'd worked for. She didn't cry until she came home and saw the empty basket. She never expected to see him again. By the time the first summer rains came, Alder had doubled in size. His legs, once wobbly and unsure, now carried him in a confident lope through the garden. He learned quickly, not just how to dig for food or climb halfway up the old apple tree, but how to recognize Martha's signals. A soft clap of her hands meant it was time to follow, a sharp click of her tongue meant stop. She didn't treat him like a pet. Her years as a teacher had taught her the difference between nurturing and coddling. If Alder was going to survive, he needed to understand the world beyond her gate, the smells, the sounds, the dangers. So they made a ritual of their walks. In the mornings, they followed the path down to the creek. Martha would crouch, pointing out where minnows darted under the shadows of rocks, or where the alder trees, his namesake, draped their roots into the water. She showed him berry patches, tapping the branches to drop the ripest fruit onto the moss for him to eat. Some days, they went farther, into the lower forest where the ground stayed cool and damp, where mushrooms pushed up through the loam. Here, she taught him to dig with deliberate strokes, not wild scrabbling, until the white grubs appeared. He watched her movements, mimicked them, and soon could uncover a meal without wasting his strength. But there were lessons in fear, too. Once, when a fox barked nearby, Alder stiffened, his ears swiveling. Martha froze, placing a steadying hand in the air between them. They waited until the sound faded, then continued. Another time, a shadow passed overhead, an eagle, and Alder instinctively dropped flat, just as she had told him. It was in those moments Martha realized something. Alder wasn't just surviving because of her care, he was learning because of her presence. She wasn't teaching a child anymore, but the patience, the steady repetition. Those habits had followed her into this strange chapter of her life. By late August, Alder was growing restless. The shed felt too small for him now. His forays into the meadow grew longer before he returned to the garden. She knew the time was coming, but her chest tightened every time she imagined the gate closing behind him for the last time. One warm evening, she left the gate unlatched. They walked together to the edge of the forest, where the tall grass gave way to shadow. Alder stopped, turning his head toward her. For a moment, she thought he might follow her home again. But then he stepped forward into the trees, the dappled light swallowing him piece by piece until he was gone. Martha stood there long after the sounds of his steps faded, listening to the summer insects hum in the tall grass. She told herself he was ready. That she had done her part. What she didn't know was that the parting wasn't an ending, it was the first link in a chain neither of them would ever break. The years after Alder left settled into a quiet rhythm. Martha's days were filled with the small comforts of retirement, tending her vegetable patch, reading by the fire, taking long walks through the meadow trails where she'd once led her schoolchildren on nature outings. She still thought about the cub sometimes, especially when she passed the alder grove by the creek. But life, as it always does, kept moving forward. It was a crisp October afternoon when the memory came to life again. Martha had been shelling beans at her kitchen table, the kettle murmuring softly on the stove. Outside, the wind carried the scent of wood smoke and dry leaves. She was humming without realizing it when she heard it, the distinct metallic clink of her garden gate latch lifting. Her first thought was of her neighbor, Ruth, who sometimes came by without knocking. But when Martha glanced out the window, her breath caught. Standing just inside the open gate, framed by a swirl of golden leaves, was a bear. Not a scrawny cub, but a full-grown adult, his shoulders broad, his coat thick and burnished by years of good health. He wasn't lumbering or restless like wild bears she'd glimpsed before. He stood still, head slightly lowered, eyes locked on hers as though measuring the space between them. The kettle began to whistle, but she didn't move. She knew that face, not in every line, perhaps, but in the way his gaze held hers without flinching. Martha opened the door slowly, stepping onto the stone path. "Alder?" Her voice trembled with the name, uncertain, almost afraid to hope. The bear took one step forward. Then another. The latch rattled lightly as the gate swung the rest of the way open. When he reached the halfway point between them, he stopped and sat, just as he used to when she gave him the signal to wait. Her heart was pounding now. She glanced at the apple tree near the shed, heavy with its last fruit of the season. Wordlessly, she walked to it, picked one of the red gold apples, and rolled it across the grass toward him. Alder lowered his head, sniffed, and took it gently in his jaws. The world seemed impossibly still in that moment. No wind, no bird calls, just the sound of him chewing, the bright scent of apple mixing with the faint musk of his fur. She didn't know why he had come. Maybe it was chance, maybe something deeper. But when he finished and looked back at her, she saw no trace of the years apart. Only recognition. From that day on, Alder's visits became a quiet rhythm of their own. They were never predictable. Sometimes months passed without a sign, sometimes he appeared twice in a single week, but they always began the same way. Martha would hear the faint click of the latch, the creak of the gate, and she'd step outside to see him waiting. He never barged in. He would stand just inside the opening, his head lowered in what almost felt like a greeting, until she motioned him forward. It wasn't the kind of relationship where she fed him like a pet. She knew better. A handful of windfall apples, a few pumpkins from the edge of her patch, maybe some corn in the late summer, enough to say, "I remember you," but never so much that he forgot how to forage for himself. What struck her most was how little he seemed to have changed at his core. He still sat when she lifted her hand, still hesitated at the invisible line between the gate and the garden until she beckoned him. And when he followed her to the edge of the meadow, he kept the same respectful distance, his paws silent on the grass. Neighbors began to notice, though not everyone believed her at first. "You mean you let a bear come to your garden?" Ruth asked one afternoon, her tone balancing between amazement and alarm. Martha only smiled and shrugged. "He's not just a bear." One particularly cold spring morning, Alder arrived with frost clinging to his fur. He seemed restless, pacing a little before settling near the apple tree. Martha fetched a bucket of water and set it down, watching as he drank slowly, steam rising from his breath in the chill air. She found herself talking to him as if he were a student again, telling him about the stubborn frost that had ruined her early peas and the gossip from town. He didn't move, just listened, or at least, stayed near her voice. It was in these visits that Martha realized what was happening between them. Alder wasn't coming for food. He came for her. For the sound of the gate opening and the same calm presence that had met him when he was half-starved and frightened in the woods all those years ago. One evening in late June, as the sun dipped low and turned the sky to honey, she watched him amble away toward the forest. The latch clicked shut behind him with its familiar sound, and she found herself smiling, the same way she had the first time a student came back years after graduating just to say hello. It was a late summer afternoon when something shifted. The air was heavy with the scent of ripening apples, and bees hummed lazily among the blossoms that still clung to Martha's late roses. She had been weeding near the fence when she heard the familiar latch click. She straightened, brushing soil from her hands, expecting to see Alder framed in the gateway as usual. And there he was, but this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him, just beyond the open gate, stood a younger bear. Smaller, leaner, its coat still with the sun-bleached look of youth. The youngster hung back, shifting its weight nervously, glancing between Alder and the garden as though unsure if it was allowed to follow. Martha's first thought was that it might be one of his offspring. She had no way of knowing for certain, but the way Alder turned his head toward it, the slow, deliberate pause he gave before stepping inside, told her this was no accident. For a moment, she hesitated. A second bear was not part of their routine, and instinct told her to be cautious. But Alder moved forward with the same steady confidence he always had, glancing back as if to say, "It's all right." She stepped aside, allowing him into the garden, though the young one stayed just outside the gate. Alder went to the apple tree, nosing the windfalls, while Martha, curious, fetched a few from her basket. She tossed one to Alder, who took it gently, then, in a gesture that made her breath catch, he dropped it just past the gate toward the younger bear. The youngster sniffed it, then began to eat, glancing up at her in quick, wary bursts. They stayed like that for a while, Alder in the garden, the younger one outside, until the sun began to sink. Then, as always, Alder walked to the gate and waited for her nod before stepping out. The younger bear fell in behind him, and together they disappeared into the deepening shade of the woods. Martha stood at the gate for a long time after, the cool air of evening settling around her. She couldn't shake the thought that Alder had brought the young bear here deliberately, not just to feed it, but to introduce it. The idea left her smiling in a way she hadn't in years. If Alder had truly brought another here, it meant he remembered the lessons she'd taught him. And maybe, just maybe, he was passing them on. After that summer evening, Martha began to notice small changes in Alder's visits. Sometimes he came alone, as before. Other times, the younger bear appeared with him, lingering just beyond the gate like a shy pupil waiting for permission to step inside. The younger one never stayed long, but Alder's patience with it was unmistakable. He would stand beside the gate, glancing from Martha to the smaller bear, as if making silent introductions. Martha found herself speaking to them the way she had to her students, calmly, gently, repeating phrases as though understanding might grow from familiarity. It wasn't long before she recognized signs of teaching. Once, she watched Alder walk to the apple tree, nudge a fallen fruit toward the younger bear, and wait until it picked it up. Another time, he led it to the shallow water trough at the side of her garden, showing it how to drink without spilling half the water with clumsy paws. One crisp September morning, she stepped out to find Alder waiting with the younger bear already in the garden, nosing the grass near the shed. She froze, half expecting trouble, but Alder glanced her way with that steady look that had always told her she could trust him. The youngster followed his lead, keeping to the open paths, not trampling her vegetables. As the sun rose higher, Martha fetched her basket of windfall apples and set them on the stone path. Alder took one, then stepped back, letting the younger bear choose next. The scene was so deliberate, so measured, that Martha felt a lump in her throat. She'd spent her life teaching children to look after one another, to pass on what they'd learned, and now she was watching the same lesson play out between two wild creatures. The visits continued through the autumn, each one reinforcing the thought that Alder's return wasn't about nostalgia alone. He was here with purpose. She didn't know whether he thought of her as a friend, a safe place, or simply part of his territory, but she could see in his behavior that the younger bear was learning. And somehow, in the quiet space between them, she felt as though Alder was saying, "This is important. You should see this." One evening, after the pair had gone and the latch clicked shut, Martha stood at the gate with her hands on the worn wood. The air was cooling, the first hints of frost curling the edges of the grass. She realized she was no longer just a retired teacher in a cottage garden. She was part of a lesson that had begun years ago in the shadow of a fallen spruce, and was still unfolding in ways she could never have imagined. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the ridge wrapped in a heavy, muffled stillness. Snow lay in deep, uneven drifts across the meadow, glittering in the pale light. Daniel stepped onto the porch, breath clouding in the cold, and looked out at the trail of deep impressions leading away into the trees. The bear's path was clear, each print sharp-edged in the new snow, heading toward the west slope. He didn't hesitate. Pulling on his snowshoes, Daniel strapped a small pack to his back, thermos, jerky, extra gloves, and took up his walking stick. He knew from the bear's pace the night before that it wouldn't be far. Bears didn't burn energy in storms unless they had a destination worth the cost. The prints wound through the pines, dipping into hollows where snow had settled deep, then climbing the low ridge where the wind had scoured the ground to a hard crust. Daniel kept to the shadows where he could, careful not to make more noise than the creak of snow beneath his own weight. About an hour in, the trail dropped into a ravine choked with spruce. Down here, the snow was shallower, the air still. He could see where the bear's massive paws had pressed through the drifts to bare earth in places. The trail curved around a boulder and then stopped. At first, he thought he'd lost it, but then he saw the gap, a dark slash between two slabs of stone, half hidden by a tangle of spruce boughs weighed down with snow. Daniel crouched, peering into the opening. A faint smell of damp earth and old pine drifted out, mixed with something warmer, animal. He eased closer, careful to keep the light at his back, and saw what could only be the bear's den. Inside, the floor was littered with dry needles and bark, arranged in a rough nest. Against one wall, he caught sight of something else, small pieces of split wood stacked in a neat, short row. Not firewood for the bear's use, of course, but stored as if ready to be carried. And then he saw movement. The bear was there, lying in the shadows, its massive head resting on its paws. It watched him with slow, steady eyes. Between them lay the quiet space of the den's threshold, a place where wild and human didn't quite overlap, but didn't repel each other either. Daniel didn't step inside. He only nodded once and whispered, "I see it now." The bear shifted slightly, enough for the light to catch the line of its muzzle. Then it closed its eyes, as if the conversation, if you could call it that, was over. Daniel turned back into the snow, leaving the tracks as they were, untouched except for his own. The image of that den, the little stack of wood within it, stayed with him the entire walk home. By December, the valley lay buried under a thick quilt of snow. The garden fence was half hidden, and the path to the gate had to be shoveled daily just to keep it visible. The cold seemed to press in on every corner of Martha's cottage, creaking the timbers at night as the wind howled down from the ridges. This was always the quietest time of year, no footsteps on the lane, no children playing in the fields, only the occasional crack of a branch under the weight of ice. It was also, she knew, the time when bears stayed tucked away in their dens. Still, her eyes drifted to the gate more often than she liked to admit. Weeks passed with no sign of Alder or the younger bear. She busied herself with her winter chores, darning socks, baking bread, keeping the wood stove fed, but the absence settled in her chest like a small, persistent ache. She found herself touching the pine branch on the mantel when she passed it, breathing in its fading scent as though it carried some trace of him. One night in mid-January, a storm came roaring over the mountains, rattling the shutters and driving snow against the windows in relentless waves. She woke twice in the night, listening to the wind, wondering if the bear's den was deep enough to keep them warm. The thought lingered into the morning. When the storm finally broke, the world outside was silent and dazzling, every branch bowed under its burden of snow. She stepped onto the porch, squinting in the pale sunlight, and her breath caught. There, faint but unmistakable, were tracks, broad, deep impressions leading from the forest to her gate. They weren't fresh enough for her to catch him still there, but the pattern told her all she needed to know. He had come in the night. She followed them to the gate, brushing away the snow that clung to the latch. The prince stopped just inside, and there in the drift was something small, a smooth, rounded stone, pale gray with a single dark stripe running through it. She lifted it in her gloved hands, turning it over. It was unlike anything she'd seen in her garden. Back inside, she set the stone beside the pine branch on the mantel. 2 gifts now. 2 visits marked not just by presents, but by something left behind. That night, as the fire cracked and the wind whispered through the chimney, she realized she had begun to feel less like she was waiting for Alder, and more like she was part of a conversation that simply paused between words. By late March, the first signs of spring began to soften the valley. The snow receded in uneven patches, revealing damp earth and the flattened remains of last summer's grass. The air carried a new scent, wet soil, budding branches, and the faint sweetness of the first blossoms pushing through. Martha had taken to walking down to the creek each morning, partly to stretch her legs, partly to see if any familiar tracks marked the thawing banks. She hadn't seen Alder since the night of the January storm, but she no longer felt the same worry she once had. The pine branch and the stone on her mantel had become quiet assurances. I was here. I remember you. It was on one of these walks, when the sky was the pale blue of early spring and the sun had just begun to warm the air, that she heard the latch click again. The sound stopped her mid-step, her boots sinking slightly in the softening ground. She turned, and there he was, Alder, framed by the open gate, fur shedding its winter frost, eyes steady as ever. But he wasn't alone. The younger bear was with him, now larger, with a richer coat and a steadier stance. Martha's heart lifted at the sight. She stood still, letting them set the pace. Alder stepped forward first, his paws leaving damp impressions on the stone path, while the younger bear lingered near the gate, watching her with the same wary curiosity it always had. When Alder reached her, he did something he had never done before. He turned his head toward the younger bear and gave a low, rumbling sound, not a growl, not quite a call, but something in between. The younger bear hesitated, then stepped inside the garden for the very first time. Martha didn't move. She let the moment settle, the soft creak of the gate in the breeze, the smell of thawing earth all around them. Alder walked to the apple tree, now bare but with green tips showing on its branches. He nudged the ground where the first shoots of grass were poking through, then looked back at the younger bear, who copied the motion, sniffing at the new growth. She realized, standing there in the pale sunlight, that she wasn't just witnessing a visit anymore. She was part of something being passed down, a memory, a lesson, a piece of trust carried from one life into another. When they left that afternoon, Alder paused at the gate, glancing back at her once before stepping into the meadow. The younger bear followed, but not before giving the garden one last, lingering look. Martha closed the gate slowly behind them, her hands warm despite the cool air. She knew they would come again, and next time, it might be the younger bear who led the way. By mid-April, the valley was in full thaw. The meadow beyond Martha's fence shimmered with fresh grass, and the apple tree in her garden wore a crown of pale pink blossoms. The air was warmer now, filled with birdsong and the distant murmur of the creek running fast with meltwater. She had started leaving the gate unlatched on mild afternoons, a quiet invitation. Most days, it swung in the breeze with no visitors. But on one golden morning, when the light slanted through the blossoms and filled the garden with drifting petals, she heard the faintest sound of heavy paws on stone. Alder stepped through first, his coat catching the sunlight in shades of bronze and gold. The younger bear followed close behind, no longer tentative, its stride was sure, its head lifted. Together, they crossed the garden without hesitation and came to stand near the apple tree. Martha stayed by the porch, letting them decide the moment. Alder looked at her for a long time, and something in his gaze felt different, fuller, almost like farewell. He turned to the younger bear, gave a soft huff, and then stepped aside. To her surprise, the younger bear approached her directly. It stopped a few feet away, then lowered its head, sniffing the air. Martha's breath caught as she extended her hand slightly, palm down. The bear leaned forward, so close she could see each whisker twitch, and inhaled slowly before stepping back. Alder made another low sound, then walked to the open gate and waited. The younger bear lingered for a moment longer, looking from Martha to Alder, before finally turning to follow him. They crossed into the meadow, sunlight spilling over their fur, and disappeared into the green. Martha stood there long after they were gone, the garden silent except for the breeze through the blossoms. She felt no sadness, only the deep, steady warmth of knowing that whatever had begun all those years ago in the shadow of a fallen spruce had come full circle. Alder had not just returned for her. He had been bringing the next chapter with him all along. Later that day, when she went to close the gate, she found something lying on the grass where Alder had paused, a small, perfect apple blossom, its petals still fresh, as if just picked. She smiled, tucking it carefully between the pine branch and the smooth gray stone on her mantle. 3 gifts. 3 seasons. A lifetime of quiet understanding. She never knew when she would see Alder again, or if she ever would. But the garden gate stayed unlatched now, and every spring the apple tree bloomed, a silent promise that the path between them was still open.